This presentation is called The Clinical Compass, Establishing Orientation on the Psychotherapeutic Expedition. The psychotherapeutic expedition takes us into uncharted territory for which the therapist needs to establish orientation from time to time. No one gets lost on a guided tour, but when setting out in search of something unknown, as we all do in an effort to make the unconscious conscious, getting lost is just part of the trip. Columbus, von Humboldt, Lewis and Clark, they all got lost along the way. But they all had their various strategies to establish orientation. Stars, the sun, the weather, maps and compasses. Freud and the other depth psychologists also got lost and along the way developed strategies to establish orientation. In this paper, I'll share some of my clinical compasses, my strategies for orienting, whenever I get lost in the bramble bushes of clinical entanglement. Lenses and worldviews. What we see depends on the lenses through which we view the world. The world cannot be seen except through a lens, and every lens distorts the view of the world, allowing us to see some things and not see others, drawing some aspects into high relief and pushing others into low relief. Psychological theories are lenses that ask specific sorts of questions in order to derive answers that illuminate the clinical encounter. The religious model is not a psychological theory, but it has long dealt with psychopathology, the suffering of the soul, about which it asks the following questions. Is this suffering a punishment from the gods, a lesson from God, possession by demons, temptations of the devil, the loss of a soul, the result of not complying fully with religious traditions, a curse, a blessing, a religious experience, etc.? The medical model asks different questions. It asks about vital signs, physical illnesses, toxins, blood levels, genes, head injuries, medication side effects, and so on. It's a powerful theoretical model with enormous clinical utility. Many non-medical trained therapists mistakenly see psychological problems in the symptoms of intoxication, dementia, hormone shifts, lack of sleep, medication side effects, poor nutrition, and various illnesses. While there may be a place for psychotherapy with many of these conditions, a treatment that ignores the medical component can sometimes spell disaster. The psychoanalytic model divides the psyche into consciousness, preconsciousness, and unconsciousness. It asks, how are behaviors shaped by unconscious motivations embedded in the instincts, desires, early childhood experience, deficits, and conflicts? It asks how the current situation reflects traumatic experiences of early childhood through the course of libido development within the context of the family. It asks, where are the fixations? What are the primary defenses? What are the object relations? What is the transference in therapy? How is the repetition compulsion reflected in early childhood experience, the contemporary life, and in the transference-countertransference relationship? The behavioral model is deceptively simple and yet very effective. It asks how behavior is learned and reinforced positively and negatively. Its applications were confined for many years to child-rearing, classrooms, prisons, institutional life, and problems such as weight loss and addiction cessation. The behavioral approach was in more recent history paired up with the cognitive approach, which asks, how are behaviors shaped by ideas, by knowledge, by information, beliefs, self-perceptions, etc.? The two combined form the powerful cognitive behavioral model, which today enjoys the support of patients, practitioners, insurance companies, and research grants. The family systems model sees the individual as a member of a family system, and asks about roles, alliances, communication patterns, pairings, triangulations, family myths, the identified patient, family secrets, and the relationship between current communication patterns and those present in the families of origin. These are brief summaries of just a few of the many models we work with, but the two main points here are these. First, one model is not more true than another, though it may be more useful in certain circumstances. The second point is that we can explore a theory and its relation to other theories by looking at the questions the theory asks and the answers it obtains. So after recognizing the different theoretical lenses and the way they invite us to think differently, we are then in a position to think about how we are going to think. We call this critical thinking, and to my mind, clinical thinking means using critical thinking to think about which theory we are going to use in our clinical work. We can think about any case through the lens of any theoretical model. One could view and describe a psychoanalytic session from a cognitive behavioral perspective, and vice versa. We can assess a patient's thinking from the perspectives of perhaps 4 different models and decide to intervene, drawing on the techniques commonly associated with one of those models. While my preferred theoretical model is psychoanalytic, I don't believe everyone needs a psychoanalytic therapy or analysis. Clinical thinking is critical thinking about the treatment of a patient. This is my first compass for providing an orientation to theory. Counseling and analytic strategies. My next clinical compass is a question. Will I be counseling or analyzing? Binding or loosening? Putting together or taking apart? From my perspective, counseling strategies put people together to help them to cope, adjust, and function. Analytic strategies take people apart, so to speak, to understand and experience the world anew. Counseling strategies are supportive, while analytic strategies interpret resistance. In counseling, we use the transference as it is, and in analytic work, we may interpret the transference. Counseling is focused on an agreed-upon external reality, while analytic work explores the patient's internal reality and ongoing construction of reality. Counseling is organized around a focused problem-solving discussion, while analytic work invites the patient to speak in a free and uncensored fashion. Counseling offers some measure of gratification, while analytic work is based on not gratifying the patient's demand. The counseling dialogue is directive, whereas the analytic dialogue is non-directive. Counseling strategies might include training and behavior management, and analytic strategies might include the interpretation of dreams, fantasies, and slips of tongue. Counseling is focused on the objects and events in the patient's life, while analytic work is focused on relationships and experiences. Counseling deals with objects and events. Analytic work deals with relationships and experiences. Counseling strategies include suggestions, case management, reframing, advice, referral, encouragement, classes, or lessons, and the establishment of external structures, and organization of the daily life. Analytic strategies include the interpretation of resistance, transference, dreams, and parapraxis, the invitation to free associate, the exploration of the repetition compulsion, the clarification of discrepancies in the narrative, the confrontation of avoided material, and the therapist's use of countertransference. By these definitions, it's not uncommon for a treatment to exist entirely within the realm of counseling. But analytic treatments usually contain a mix of analytic and counseling strategies. The ratio will be determined by the patient's capacity to understand the technique and tolerate the anxiety, by the nature of the problem, and by the analytic capacity of the therapist or analyst. It is inappropriate to do analytic work with a patient that needs a counseling approach, and it is a shame to counsel a patient that can use and has the capacity for analytic work. Making the unconscious conscious. Freud tells us we want to make the unconscious conscious, and we do so by inviting the patient to speak in a free and uncensored fashion. We then listen to what is said and how it is said, and how the patient is not speaking, how the patient employs resistances to avoid speaking about that which needs to be said. I think of psychological symptoms as sitting like caps on top of untold stories. When I can help my patient to say what is difficult to speak about, we are working to make the unconscious conscious. The invitation to free associate is a mission impossible. No one can do it fully, but we all don't do it in a different way. We all use different resistances and develop different transferences. The resistances and transferences are what get in the way of the free associations, but they are also part of the fabric of psychic structure and the therapy itself. When I feel lost in the session, when I don't know what is going on, when my brain seemingly turns to wood, I ask myself, how is my patient speaking and trying not to say something? How is my patient not saying something? What is not being said? What am I not hearing? What do I not want to hear? What is the story under the story? That said, there are other times when we are confused, sleepy, or feeling thick-headed, when it is best to simply allow ourselves to slide into the moment, set our compasses aside, and just listen carefully, without anticipating the next word or trying to make sense of it at all. Inducting the patient into an analytic dialogue. It is common for a patient to require some preparation to be inducted into an analytic dialogue. Some therapists will simply start analyzing, and if the patient catches on, that's great. I prefer to be explicit. Many patients are very concrete and or rational in their thinking, and so groundwork becomes necessary or useful from my perspective. This groundwork is didactic and includes a number of common themes. When caught on the rocks of concrete thinking, for example, it is useful to help patients see that there is a difference between an event and their own unique experience of that event, and the understanding that others may have different experiences of that same event. That I find is useful to be absolutely explicit about. Many people go through life thinking their view of the world is the way the world is. And it's a shock and a surprise to see what I refer to as the Rashomon effect. You know, Kurosawa's movie, Rashomon, where there's an assault involving several people, and the movie shows you the same assault over and over again from each different person's perspective. That was a revolution in cinematography, but similarly, it's one that we go through over and over again. The discovery that the way I'm seeing the world is not the way everybody sees it, nor is it the way the world really is. It's my interpretation, it's my view of it, and I find it very useful to speak very concretely with my patients about this understanding, to help them begin to see how is it that they are seeing the world. Similarly, there's a difference between an object or a person and one's relationship to that object or person. Furthermore, knowing the difference between reality and fantasy allows people to freely explore their fantasies, to better understand themselves, and at the same time not feel at risk of acting out sexually, violently, or suicidally. Another point is that we do not deal with the past. Well, let me just stop on that for a moment. I use the word fantasy to describe, if someone is angry with their boss and they want to kill him, I'd call that a fantasy. If they're feeling suicidal, I'd call that a fantasy. If they're feeling attracted to somebody, I'd call that a fantasy. Where is the ideation carrying you? And to help them, the patient see that these are not plans. A patient came to me and he says, I'm frightened. What's wrong? He says, I'm feeling suicidal. And I say to him, is this a poem or a plan? You see, if it's a plan, we're going to call, and get transportation to the hospital. If it's a poem, we're going to find out what it means. Let's talk about it. Let's not just accept it at face value. If you get angry with your boss and you say you're going to kill him, no one thinks you're going to go out and really kill him. They know it's a metaphor. They know you're just thinking that way. Same thing with, you're driving down the street and you have a thought about the guy in the next car. Guess what? You have the same kinds of thoughts all the time about the guy in the next car over. What thoughts are you thinking about the guy in the car? Because it's different from the next guy over and his thoughts about the people in the other cars. So it's valuable to be able to understand and recognize that one's fantasies can be seen as metaphors. To me, metaphor is the key in the lock to understand and to find meaning in clinical material. Another point is that we do not deal with the past as an intellectual exercise, but deal with the past as it exists and motivates behavior in the present. When we see how the scenarios of early childhood experience are repeated in the problems of daily life, as well as in dreams, fantasies, and transference, we are entering the realm of the repetition compulsion and inviting the patient to make the unconscious conscious. I'll have another presentation, perhaps tomorrow, on the repetition compulsion. I find it amazing that we aren't always talking about the repetition compulsion. To me, it's the absolute center point idea of psychoanalysis. There are so many different issues. There's transference, and there's resistance, and there's the past, and there's the present, and there's the psychopathology. It all comes together in the hub of the repetition compulsion. I think it's an extremely valuable idea. The more obsessional patients sometimes find it useful to have a clear definition of logical thinking and analogical thinking, to think in analogy. They typically use logical thinking in their life and in their work. It is concrete, cause and effect type of rational thinking that's very effective in many parts of their life. But when they use this mode of thinking in regard to their psyche and their symptoms, they fall into the trap of thinking the psyche is a machine that needs a replacement part or needs to be fixed in some way. It requires a leap of understanding to see that while early childhood experience, day-to-day problems, and the transference relationships are separated by space and time, and therefore not causally or logically related, they are indeed analogically related. They are analogies to each other, and this understanding offers the possibility of seeing oneself differently and granting a new place in one's life for how we think about relationships, affects, the body, symptoms, and sexuality. I have many patients who are working in the computer and high-tech industry, and for many of them, it's really quite a leap to get to the idea that their emotional problems are not logical problems. And then they say, well, if it's not logical, it must be illogical. And I say, no. It's not logical. It's analogical. That's the key in the door. That's where we find meaning. And that's where it becomes more understandable to see today's problem with one's spouse as being in some ways related to one's experience of early childhood and witnessing one's parents in action. When thinking about problematic behaviors such as substance abuse, forbidden affairs, speeding, reckless driving, high-risk behavior, criminal acts, or the overuse of video games or pornography, we make an error when we become moralistic. We will do much better when we think of the function of such behavior, what the behavior forecloses, or what doesn't happen when engaging in that behavior. Every runner is consciously running toward the finish line, but is also running away from the starting blocks. So what's being avoided? What is the patient running from in the pursuit of these different interests? Not, I play video games because I like them, but I play them because I don't know what to do with myself without them. Or I choose, I'm a mild-mannered kind of reporter for the Daily Planet, and I play, first-person shooter video games to address something else. Oh, I just like it, we will hear our patients say. And we want to be able to help them recognize that there are lots of video games out there. You just like this one. And that says something about who you are, and it says something about your emotional life. The more analytic the work is, the more the patient speaks and the more the therapist listens. Patient questions are explored rather than answered. Demands are ungratified. External reality fades a bit, and personally constructed reality begins to dominate. The hard events of the consensual reality recede, and the analytic dialogue enters into the realms of the dream, imagination, and their constructed reality. To induct the patient into an analytic dialogue is sometimes a clunky educational process, like dragging an aluminum rowboat across the rocks to get it into the water. But once in the water, the analytic water, the patient free associates and the boat moves in a very different way. Part of inducting the patient into an analytic dialogue means withdrawing gratification little by little until the patient can tolerate greater levels of anxiety, ask questions without receiving answers, speak without immediate replies, and little by little begins to listen to his or her own associations. The reasons we don't answer personal questions in analytic work is not because we are secretive, but because we want to engage the patient's imagination. We don't want our life to get in their way, and also because we are not models for our patients. While the patient's questions may signal the engagement of the imagination, our concrete answers often foreclose that imagination. Metaphor and dream. Imagination, dreams, fantasies, and art are full of metaphors, and the repetition compulsion is often more apparent and easier to grasp when we find it in a dream than when it is encountered in problems with one's boss or spouse. Part of inducting the patient into an analytic dialogue means helping the patient to think in metaphor, to think figuratively, to recognize analogies between one relationship and another. Along with the art of thinking in metaphor is being able to recognize that a dream is neither a static metaphor translatable into stock meanings with the aid of an ancient dream book, nor is it a meaningless electrical discharge in the brain. Dreams contain wish-fulfilling meaning that can be interpreted, provided we have the free associations of the patient and the metaphorical thinking of both the patient and therapist. It's valuable to think logically about problems in psychotherapy, but when we get into the analytic aspects of the therapy, we want to induct the patient into analogical thinking. A man may find his father to be envious of him, but a father's envy does not logically make the son's boss envious 30 years after the son left home. But if we find an analogical relation in the dynamic of envy between the father and son, and between the son and his boss, we may get closer to discovering how the son assumes a role, falls into a role, or is sensitive to an envious dynamic. If a mother does not listen to her daughter, and the daughter does not feel heard, then later in her adult life, we won't be surprised to discover that the daughter has developed a difficulty in listening to her own daughter as well. The psychoanalytic interest in the past is not an intellectual treasure hunt in pursuit of historical truth. It is an expedition in search of a narrative truth that demonstrates how the past is present. Sometimes a young man marries a girl like the girl that married dear old dad. And sometimes he marries a girl who has characteristics more like his dad than his mother. The analogical nature of relationships in early childhood and later adult relations is based on parallel contours in the dynamics of those relations. Those dynamics typically include themes of abandonment, betrayal, envy, deceit, being left out, misunderstanding, triangulation, lack of recognition, loss, jealousy, hostility, entrapment, oppression, bullying, suspicion, boundary crossing, enabling, controlling, and so on. In 1953, Josephine Hilgard recognized the phenomena she described as anniversary reactions. She summarized two examples in the following way. Quote, Mary Bancroft's psychosis began when her daughter was 6, her own age when her father died. James Carson's illness began when his son reached the age of 4, his age when his father died. His father's death, as he unconsciously interpreted it, was mirrored in his own symptoms. These losses by death in childhood are the focal episodes that led to a possible explanation of the illness, and when understood, led to some therapeutic gains. Unquote. I've seen on several occasions a similar phenomenon, in which adults who in childhood had parents that divorced, subsequently, they had problems with their own children. For example, an adult who had parents that divorced when he was 13 may find that later in life, when he has a child of his own, things may go very well until his own child reaches the age of 13, and then suddenly and mysteriously, he doesn't feel he knows how to deal with that child. This is another way in which metaphor and analogical thinking become useful ways of looking at clinical material. The analogical contours of early trauma get reproduced under similar interpersonal dynamics. When inducting the patient into a more analytic dialogue around the dream, we often need to recognize for the patient how the day residue is a point of orientation in external reality. But we then want to decenter it by pointing out that the dream is not simply a recorded memory of the past or a plan for the future. The patient experienced many things during the past few days, but the unconscious has carefully selected, so to speak, a constellation of images that metaphorically illuminate the patient's desires and conflicts. When we can draw the patient into a playful attitude toward the dream, we often discover that the dynamics metaphorically revealed are curiously similar to early family dynamics and current life problems. When it comes to suicidal thoughts or the fantasies of sexual or violent acting out, our question needs to be, is this a poem or a plan? If it is a poem, we can understand the metaphors embedded in the poetry. We can understand it figuratively and thereby derive meaning from it. If it is a plan, we need to address it literally and take whatever measures are indicated to limit the potential danger or invite the patient to try to think of it metaphorically. I worked for 9 years in a crisis clinic, and so we had many people. I mean, every day we had lots of people that would come in who were suicidal. Many clinicians will say, oh, the patient said they're suicidal, so they have to go to the hospital. But if you stop and you say, you're suicidal, what's that mean? Suddenly you start having a conversation. You know, some people say, do you have a plan? You know, the plan tells you something about the psychology. You know, one person says, yeah, I'm going to take an overdose of some medication. Somebody else says, well, I'm going to slice my wrists. Somebody else says, oh, I'm going to put a corkscrew through my eye. Now, that's probably not even going to kill somebody, but it makes us feel like, ugh. You know, someone says, oh, I'm going to drink Clorox. I'm going to throw myself in front of a train. And you can feel how with some, there is this extraordinary aggression that is just like, you know, all over the place. And others, it's sort of a return to mother kind of, you know, oh, I'm going to get myself in my blankets, I'm going to cuddle up, and I'm just going to sort of sail out. Now, there's probably aggression under that too. But one way or another, when you get into the details of what they're thinking about and what effects it's going to have, all of a sudden you're having a conversation. You're having an analytic conversation. And you're no longer dealing with suicide as a plan, but as a poem that means something. And what we might be able to find in it. 3 discourses. Thinking metaphorically is a way to open the door to psychological depth and personal meaning. We seek to find the analogous relations between the dynamics embedded in early childhood experience, the dynamics of present-day living, and the dynamics of the transference. These are the three discourses. Early childhood experience, present-day living, dynamics of the transference. When the patient speaks, I want to listen carefully and place subtitles under the narrative. If the patient speaks about early childhood, I try to hear it as a metaphor of the present-day narrative and also as a metaphor with transferential implications. So it's 2 sets of subtitles. Similarly, if the patient discusses present-day material, that is, what has been happening in his or her life between sessions, I try to hear it as a metaphor for both the transferential narrative and the genetic narrative. And of course, when the patient speaks of his or her relation to me, I want to be attentive to the genetic and present-day subtexts. I sometimes, in working with parents, children will say, you know, I hate you, and parents get terribly upset about this. And I'm thinking, children are foreign films. You got to put subtitles under what they say. What's the subtitle under I hate you? Oh, I don't like it when you set limits with me. Okay, yeah, that could be. It could be something else too. But it's very important to be able to get disconnected from this concrete, literal worldview and try to enter into a conversation where we get to what it is people are trying to say. Countertransference. Psychoanalysis used to view countertransference as entirely the problem of the therapist, for which the therapist was expected to return to his or her own analyst in order to solve that problem. In 1948, Heinrich Racker, and to a lesser extent Paula Hyman, introduced the idea that the countertransference can sometimes be viewed as a kind of unconscious message sent from the animal sand, which evokes or provokes in the therapist some particular sorts of reactions. Not surprisingly, these reactions often characterize the interpersonal problems for which the patient is seeking therapy. When the therapist can observe the countertransference reactions as clinical material, metabolize them, understand them, and return them to the patient in the form of interpretations, the countertransference becomes an important clinical tool. In 2014, interpreting one's countertransference has become, that was when this paper was presented originally. We can say in 2016, interpreting one's countertransference has become commonplace. But I think it's important to remember that the countertransference reaction is actually co-constructed by both the patient and the therapist or analyst, and that it might be valuable to think about countertransference reactions as containing more components from the patient or more from the therapist, but always being a combination of the two, and always a bit more of one than the other. This would enable us to recognize exactly what Freud saw in the countertransference, the personal problems of the therapist getting in the way of the patient's treatment, while at the same time acknowledging that the conscious and unconscious communication from the patient often creates pressure and has an impact on the therapist, which when handled properly can be used as a clinical tool to understand the dynamics of therapy. The first time I ever recognized a countertransferentially generated thought was when I was seeing a young woman who was depressed and intermittently engaged in self-mutilation. In one session, she was speaking, as I had invited her to, in a free and uncensored fashion. This was a young woman. She must have been in her early 20s, and she had various cigarette burns on her forearms, which she would put there typically while she was drunk. So she was speaking, and suddenly I just stopped listening to her. I'm sure I remained looking at her and nodding appropriately, but I was completely lost in a story a friend once told me. The friend was a nurse, and she had explained that she once had a patient who was a large woman who had an impacted bowel. As a nurse, my friend had to remove the bowel digitally. That means with her fingers. With each piece of bowel removed, the patient comically began to rejoice and sing in an operatic voice. When I realized what I was recalling this amusing story instead of listening to my patient, I immediately concluded that it must have something to do with what my patient was saying. The next thing my patient did was to issue a deep sigh of relief and say, "It feels so good to get this all out." Another time I had a patient who was a particularly tiny woman. It was obvious that I was larger than her, but as she would sit in her chair squirming and cowering, I had the strange feeling of actually being about 18 feet tall, massive, and potentially violent at any moment. I recognized these as very foreign experiences, but they returned in each session with her, and with her alone. As she was looking at me with fear, I thought, oh my gosh, this poor woman, she looks terrified. What has happened to her? She looks frightened of me. What has happened to her that she comes to me with such fear? Why does she fear me? What have I done to frighten her? I don't like feeling that I'm frightening her. In fact, it's starting to piss me off, and I'm about ready to haul off and... See, it was like she kept pulling for this thing until the next thing I knew, I was starting to feel like this hulking character. So there you have it, a cowering patient squirming in her chair as if threatened until the corresponding hostility is conjured in the therapist. None of you will be surprised when I say that she was a victim of brutal violence in her family of origin, and that this was a tradition she continued as both a victim and victimizer with her live-in boyfriend. With countertransferential erotic and aggressive fantasies, I like to invite myself to elaborate the feeling into a fantasy and look for clues embedded in the metaphors of the drama that may give me insight into the clinical relationship. When we recognize that psychotherapy is a place where the patient can say anything and do nothing, a place where the therapist listens and interprets, and a place where the narratives of transference and countertransference are subject to metaphorical interpretation, there's no room to even begin to act out in concrete and unethical ways. The transferential countertransferential fantasies are there to be interpreted. The function of the symptom. Many patients understandably view their symptoms as obstacles or problems to get rid of, and they can often convince us of this perspective. Nonetheless, it is important that we remember that the symptoms are overdetermined and have multiple functions. That is, they are the result of many factors, and they typically fulfill many functions. But while lost in the bramble bushes, we can simply wonder, what function or functions does this symptom serve? Alcoholism is not the problem. Alcoholism is the symptom that serves the function of covering a problem like anger, frustration or pain, loss of important others, the hurts of childhood, social anxieties, various conflicts. Marijuana can function to disengage one from interpersonal frustrations or to avoid being emotionally present. Amphetamine can function as an antidepressant. Similarly, manic behavior is a way of driving fast to get away from the guy in the back seat. So who's in the back seat? What inner voice is the person trying not to hear? Loud, persistent music in the car sometimes serves the purpose of drowning out voices in our head, our doubts, anxieties, self-critiques, frustrations, and unfulfilled longings. Compulsive use of pornography can help us to escape our own incestuous fantasies, soothe our sexual fears and inadequacies, provide a barrier against the disappointments of the day, and so on. Compulsive video game usage can serve as a link to the outer world for someone who is isolated, or provide a wall to avoid social interaction for someone with more options. When brothers and sisters fight, sometimes they are discharging envy and jealousy, and sometimes it is a way to both avoid and engage incestuous impulses. Children frightened by the dark, who routinely end up in the parents' bed, often turn out to be helping one or both parents to avoid sexual relations. Attitudes of superiority cover feelings of inferiority, and vice versa. To understand the function of symptoms, we want to be where the patient isn't. We don't just look to where the patient is running, but also from where or from what the patient is running. Development. When Freud described the sequential movement of attention from the oral to the anal to the genital zones, he helped us to see the cognitive apparatus. The cognitive apparatus senses, perceives, and organizes the world through the erogenous zones of the body and their encounters with frustrations presented by the social surround. Socialization, or the regulation of desires, takes place first and foremost around what Freud called the erogenous zones of the body. The inevitable traumas of child leave their oral, anal, and genital traces in the forms of metaphors embedded in dreams, fantasies, symptoms, personality styles, hobbies, personal interests, and styles of life. I would be lost in the concrete world of a patient's suffering if I did not have metaphor as a way to find and attribute psychosexual meaning to psychopathology. Another developmental compass that I find useful is the idea of development as a metaphorical walk across the room. On one side of the room, at birth, we find self-absorption, a focus on one's body, cosmic time, or the eternal now, and cosmic space, or the universal here. On the other side of the room is awareness of the other, the sublimation of bodily interest into an interest in the world, linear time, and three-dimensional space. With healthy development, the normal self-absorption of the baby transforms into the ability to move back and forth from self-absorption to involvement with others, social awareness, and engagement with the world. All young children are appropriately involved with learning how to manage their bodies, their discomforts and anxieties, but by the time they reach latency ages, we hope they have learned to manage those aspects well enough to sublimate bodily preoccupations into an interest in the world around them. Every infant is born into cosmic time, the eternal now. The only thing important to the infant is what's happening now. A large part of socialization is learning how to wait, learning how to delay gratification of the impulse, to fulfill what Freud called the child's great cultural achievement, the renunciation of instinctual gratification. To learn how to wait is to enter linear time, with a past, a present, and a future. Problems of impulse control have to do with the collapse of linear time under the weight of stress, for example. Every infant lives in the universal here. Here is the only place to be, and pleasures are felt, pains endured, and tensions discharged here, and not surprisingly, now. To be toilet trained is to enter three-dimensional space and linear time. For love of mother, we place our treasured feces, not here, but there, and not now, but later. A civilized person is one who can manage impulses within the prohibitions of society, sliding gracefully between self-absorption and relatedness, between body and the social, between the body and the social, between cosmic time and linear time, between cosmic space and three-dimensional space. But it is, of course, entirely possible to grow up and not make it all the way across the room, so to speak, on some of these dimensions. And indeed, many psychopathologies are distinguished by self-absorption, bodily preoccupations, difficulties relating to others, impulsiveness, and so on. Another aspect of the developmental perspective is cognitive development, from primary process thinking to secondary process thinking, and Melanie Klein's work on the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. Beyond the diachronic development of these thought process and positions is the synchronic aspect, in which we recognize the earlier modes of cognition present not only in dream states, but also in neurotic states, psychotic states, and in a wide variety of derivative material and eruptions of unconscious conflict while under stress. A developmental viewpoint helps us to see symptoms as dynamic, historical, and serving a function. While I may be thinking in terms of psychosexual stages, primitive fantasies, and the derivative material, I try to address myself to the material on the surface of the narrative and interpret the defense or transference with tact and timing, so as to stay close to the patient's concerns and affects. I only make deeper or more challenging interpretations when it is reasonably clear that I have the rapport necessary to do so. Diagnosis. Coming into the home stretch here. Diagnosis is a swamp. Psychiatric diagnoses are a mix of genetic problems, cerebral injuries, toxic reactions, biochemical imbalances, and then there are many problems of daily living which have been shoehorned into medical diagnoses largely as a way to make them more real, in a sense, in a materialistic worldview. I think it can be very useful to some if they think of their emotional problems as concrete medical problems. But anxiety is not the same as tuberculosis, and depression is not the same as a viral infection. Yes, some people have a genetic problem, or have a head injury, or have a psychotoxin in the brain, but people do not have depression. They depress their anger. They engage in self-criticism. They suffer survival guilt. They hold themselves back in the name of another. People do not have anxiety. No, they avoid the present by living in anticipation of a frightening future. They catastrophize, totalize, and transform their aggression into self-destructive worrying. I once worked in a low-fee medical clinic as the clinic's counselor. A mother brought her 10-year-old boy to me saying the teachers wanted him to get counseling and she would be back in an hour. I explained that I would need to speak with her first. You had that patient, I see. The teacher said he needs help. Okay, I'll be back in an hour. You'll take care of it. So I explained I would need to speak with her first. She regretfully stayed and told me a story that made it quite evident that the boy was acting out at school in a desperate attempt to deal with a conflict between his parents at home. This came out in blazing colors in 1 hour, first session. I asked her to return the following week with her husband. She said that was impossible, but she would return on her own. She did so, and the story only elaborated the initial impression. The next week, she insisted that I see the boy and give him a good talking to. I saw the boy, and again, the conflict at home dominated the clinical picture. I asked the mother to return the next week, and while she agreed, she never showed up. 6 months later, I saw the mother in the reception room of the clinic, which was a general medical clinic. "Oh, doctor," she called. "I took my son to the pediatrician, and he told me he has ADD. He gave him some pills, and now everything's okay again." I say, "Oh, very good. Best wishes." But of course I felt sad for the boy, who now has ADD and has meds, and still has his parents fighting as usual. Now, I'm not saying that all ADD is related. I think ADD is a constellation of symptoms that can be derived from a very, very wide variety of experience. I've seen kids in a French-American school, they didn't speak French and they were jumping out of their seats. Other kids, they haven't had breakfast. Other kids, it appears to be some sort of neurological problem that gets cooking. But so often there is something going on in the family, and the kids like a hot potato and just jumping out of their skin, trying to come to terms with what's going on. In the past, children that we now say have ADD were said to be bad seeds, cursed, possessed, or naughty. Maybe there is advancing, changing our formulation from a state of being to a thing one can have or possess. But I long for the day when psychiatric diagnoses will become more dynamic. I once worked with a boy who was diagnosed as having ADD, largely because he was not having breakfast in the morning. Another was not able to focus well, sitting at a desk in the class, at the back of the class. Another was overwhelmed by a stimulus-rich classroom and several bird nests that spilled off the counters onto his desk. Another boy whose undiagnosed vision problems precluded his being able to read the blackboard, so he fidgeted in his chair. And then there was the very intelligent new student at the French-American school who could not pay attention and got into all sorts of mischief because he did not understand French. And as I said in the beginning, what we see depends on how we look at the object of our observation. And our various ways of describing what we see often have implications for treatment. Does the schizophrenic have a chemical imbalance, or has he withdrawn his libido from the world? Is this a healthy response to a crazy family or a crazy society? Is he caught in a double bind? Is he having a visionary experience, a kundalini experience, or is he God intoxicated? Is schizophrenia a process of progressive deterioration or an attempt at self-healing? However we formulate the problem will shape how we see it and have implications for how we treat it. I have mused today on some of the ways we can get lost in the process of our clinical work and some strategies for reorienting and carrying on with the exploration. When we go on a psychotherapeutic expedition, we need not be afraid of getting lost. We will get lost. If we allow ourselves to get close to our patients, getting lost will simply be a part of the expedition. And while there's no need to panic, we do want to make a point of having a compass in our back